This evening on Fineprint, we break down what's been an eventful day and study the message behind the optics. We also get you ground reports. WION's associate editor Palki Sharma Upadhyay and senior correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran have been getting us the minute-by-minute developments from Wuhan and Seoul. But before all that, let's take you to Wuhan, where the leaders of India and China met for possibly their most wide-ranging talks ever. On the first day of the dialogue, Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping spent considerable amount of time together, most of it minus their diplomats. WION was there in Wuhan to witness the historic meet firsthand. Take a look.
This is a meeting that could shape the future of India-China ties. Asia watchers remain glued to the informal dialogue between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. On Friday, both leaders began their conversation. The Chinese President gave a warm welcome to the Indian Prime Minister at the Hubei Provincial Museum in Wuhan.
भारत और चीन की दोनों की विशेषता थी कि हमारी सारी संस्कृति नदियों के किनारे पर। भारत के भी 5000 साल पहले मोहनजोदड़ो, हड़प्पन, इस कल्चर की अगर हम चर्चा करें तो सारा विकास नदी के तट पर होता था।
The two leaders spent considerable time together. They held talks at the State Guest House in the city. The Chinese President also hosted a dinner for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There was no protocol or agenda for the talks.
मैं बहुत प्रभावित हुआ था जिस प्रकार से वाटरवे के लिए काम किया, बिजली का काम किया और बहुत अच्छा टूरिस्ट सेंटर भी डेवलप हो गया।
While the event may have been billed as an informal conversation between both leaders, this is perhaps the most wide-ranging dialogue between India and China in the recent history. It's an attempt by both sides to iron out their differences after the Doklam standoff in 2017.
Let's broaden this up and delve deeper into the various aspects and facets of what the day really has been today. Professor Swaran Singh, China expert, is joining us from New Delhi. Also joining us is Andrew Leung, international and independent strategist, joining us. Professor, let me come to you first. It's been a day full of optics. What do you make of the Modi-Xi rendezvous so far?
I think I saw WION is covering both the summits, and that's really interesting because these two potentially might be game changers for Asian landscape. But let's focus on China-India summit, which is the one we are discussing. In that sense, I think it's also potentially, again, we are only focusing on what potentially this could prove, because at this stage, this is only focusing on very broad understandings of two very, very decisive leaders who can move mountains potentially again, provided they develop a kind of a mutual understanding. But this is also important to understand. This is part of the way Chinese conduct such high-level meetings. And since he came to power, Xi Jinping has been talking about reorganizing great power relationships. And his meetings with American presidents right from beginning, 2013 when he had gone to Latin America and had a kind of a casual meeting, conversation with President Obama in Sunnylands in California, till the last meeting in Florida with President Trump. So that's the strategy that she applies in conducting affairs with great leaders, to have a no neckties, kind of a free floating discussion over a retreat. It's interesting to see he puts Indian Prime Minister into that league now. And in that sense, informal meeting for 2 days is potentially adventurous also, because they are allowing two leaders to have as many as 5 to 6 hours together, including particularly the public display in walk and boat ride of what kind of chemistry they are going to project and display in that. But we understand this has happened very gradually in a piecemeal manner. When Xi Jinping first came to India in 2014 September, the first meeting took place in Ahmedabad, that iconic picture on the swing by the riverside. Before he came to New Delhi for a formal meeting, same happened when Modi went to China in 2015. President Xi flew to Xi'an to spend time with Prime Minister Modi in an informal setting, then came to Beijing for a formal sitting. So I think this informality had been gradually, incrementally built into now at a level when they have confidence to spend 2 full days doing nothing but having casual conversations as if. But Chinese are placing it, if you notice, the spokesperson of Foreign Ministry said they are going to look at their role in the future, looking at the change in the landscape in 100 years.
And also, touching upon that statement that came in from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson there in China, stressing on how India's assistance is being looked at, especially in the US-led global war and amidst those fears of that trade war as well. That's
right. The whole change of relationship that China is experiencing with the United States, protectionism is one part of it. And even, in fact, European nations are beginning to be, stringent laws on immigration again, not only United States. So this is impacting both India in terms of services and China in terms of commodities. So they have to really find ways and means how they can really continuously develop bilateral economic relations. So I assume you already noticed the rise in exports from India, 40% last year. And I'm hearing after these tariffs going up with United States, sugar, soybean, cotton are shooting up from India in terms of exports to China. So for Prime Minister Modi in the coming election year, if bilateral trade crosses $100 billion, this is interesting. If there is a promise of a major investments, potentially big ticket investments that China can promise in this sense, that will address the issue of deficit, for example. So I think that kind of understandings where the big change can be brought about bilaterally, and Xi Jinping is looking for Indian engagement, indulgence for 2 things very quickly. One, 2016 speech at Davos, which hoisted him as the global leader for globalization and free trade, and Indian Prime Minister spoke the same place January this year. And realization that China cannot be global leader in that sense unless the largest economy next door, which is growing fastest, is on board with them. And more specifically, his pet project of BRI, which is not really moving very fast forward the way it was imagined it should, because all the mega projects are not commercially viable. And now the political legitimacy, because last week only the European ambassadors in Beijing issued a report condemning BRI, saying it's opaque, unclear, it had a lot of problems. So an opinion emerging that BRI could have issues is raising issue of political legitimacy. So he has to get India on board. India has its own compulsions to come on board because all our friends and allies are going and joining BRI, Russia, Iran, Nepal, Afghanistan, everybody is going there. So I think that is going to be another important understanding to develop from here.
So, and you right at the outset mentioned how both of these summits taking place on the same day. It's an interesting coincidence there. And WION, of course, has been tracking both the summits very closely. We'll, of course, delve deeper into how both the summits have the potential to cause tectonic shifts in geopolitics in the respective regions. But let me just also get in Andrew at this point. Andrew, as Professor Singh just mentioned, the compulsions, or rather the, impetus for China to come to the discussion table. What does China really hope to achieve at the end of this informal meeting?
Well, first of all, I'd like to focus on the geopolitics behind this very cordial meeting at a time when the United States seems to be pushing back against China's rise in more ways than one. It's not just only the trade war, it is the perception that the United States is allying some of the countries for example, Japan, Australia, and India in a loosely defined Quad, QUAD, pushing against China's influence in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean, in a kind of perceived China containment policy. So at the time of this, when these worries are beginning to surface, this meeting really telling the world that India and China are not at loggerheads. And indeed, as far as India is concerned, the foreign policy has always been on a non-alignment foreign policy, and China is not forming blocks with any firm blocks with any country. So I think that both sides can see eye to eye in a world where the so-called Cold War blocks don't work anymore. The whole world is interconnected, and countries can be both rivals as well as partners, depending on the partnerships. And this is precisely the idea that an informal meeting like this can focus on areas of possible and clear the air on issues where there's mutual distrust. And then they fall into four categories. One is bilateral security between India and China, for example, issues like Pakistan and of course, border disputes. The second issue is, of course, as I mentioned just now, geopolitics, China's perceived influence in the Indian Ocean and so on and so forth. So it's necessary to clear the air. And thirdly is economics, whether China can both sides can cooperate in areas which can bring benefits to both India and China, and how this is going to be done. For example, China is excellent in this infrastructural building, and whereas India needs infrastructure to push its agenda of economic development, creating more jobs and building its manufacturing capabilities. For this, it is very efficient infrastructure, and perhaps China can help in there. But also, lastly, in the world order, both Asian giants important role to play in safeguarding those world trading systems based on well-tried and beneficial trading system that benefits not only China and India but the rest of the world, depending on institutions which have been around for many decades.
Absolutely. Andrew, stay with me, and Professor Singh, I'll just come back to you as well. And that, of course, is not the only meeting that happened today. As informal as it was, there was another meeting, a rather formal one, that took place for the first time in decades, which, of course, has made history as well. The two Koreas made history, the two nations which had been at loggerheads for close to 7 decades. In a historic summit, which was high on pomp and symbolism, undertook to convert the 1953 armistice into a formal peace treaty later this year. Here's a look at the day's big developments as North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in met at the South Korean side of the demilitarized zone.
Sharp at 9:30 Korean time, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un reached the Peace House in Panmunjom village for his historic summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Every act in this meeting was meticulously choreographed. The two leaders shook hands on the line dividing the two Koreas and exchanged pleasantries. As Kim Jong-un stepped over the line, called the 38th parallel, he became the first North Korean leader to set foot in South Korean soil. His wife, Ri Sol-ju, arrived separately. At the Peace House, reflecting the mood of the summit, Kim signed in the guest book with this message: "A new history begins now, the age of peace, at the starting point of history." The two Korean leaders also planted a pine tree from the year 1953, when the armistice ending the Korean War was signed. The two leaders threw soil sourced from north and south and watered the plant. In the defining image of the day, the two leaders walked over a blue-painted bridge in the demilitarized zone and, seated on a bench, had a one-on-one conversation, lasting almost 30 minutes. Later, addressing the media, Kim Jong-un made some general remarks, promising not to repeat past mistakes.
I have crossed such a borderline, and I come here.
북한남 언결의 소망과 기대를 무겁게 받아들이고 북남 인민들이 절실히 바라는 문제 해결을 위해 많은 의제들을 진지하게
We hope that the peninsula could hear more signs of peace, and on top of that, we are going to take a lot of effective measures so that peace and prosperity will settle down here in the
Professor Singh and Andrew, stay with us. Andrew, let me come to you first. We're talking about these two meetings now, and both of them having the potential to be game changers, as Professor Singh also pointed out right at the outset. We're talking also about nations who were on the cusp of a war recently, trying to resurrect the relationship. What, according to you, has been the takeaway from both these meetings today?
Well, I think, as I said before, I think more and more nations are beginning to realize that the old mindset of a Cold War mindset is me against you and forming blocks and using confrontational and coercive tactics to impose one's will on others does not necessarily work, even against weaker nations, because the world is now becoming much more interconnected, and even a smaller country, or even a non-country like the ISIS can really, sort of cause a lot of havoc for much bigger nations for a very, very long time. So I think that the more and more nations are beginning to realize that coercive tactics and one-size-fits-all formula imposing on others does not work. And each country has a different history, has a different socio-economic background, and each country can find its own development path. And this is the kind of thinking that informs both India and China. For example, for India, it's always been on a non-aligned policy, trying to find its own path, and for China as well, suffering from the so-called centuries of humiliation, and it's now the time for China to rise again. But in the case of China, the rise of China, of course, caused a lot of repercussions around the world order, dominated by the West, and dominated, of course, by a single superpower. And China is perceived to be an emerging challenger. And of course, all these cause problems. I think the problems, many countries are realize that all these problems, consequences must be taken in their stride. And in this interconnected world, there's no use just looking at confrontation and trying to guard one's own interests without mindful of the other side's interests. So I think the idea is to look for areas for cooperation, understanding, and also looking to the future and the new challenges facing the world. For example, climate change, the kind of energy security, financial risks. And a lot of things can be done in coming to some kind of a consensus so that both sides can work together.
All right, hold that thought, Andrew. Professor, as we've been talking about the potential that these two meetings have had, speaking of tectonic shifts that these two meetings could cause, the Korean meeting has been described as being seismic, given the energy levels that one saw the two leaders after decades of being at loggerheads, raising a toast, embracing each other. But given the interesting coincidence that these two meetings take place on the same day, there's a lot of interlinking as well. Yes. Many have spoken about how China's influence when it comes to the Korean Peninsula somewhat diminishing. Would you agree? And that's one of the reasons why it also came to the discussion table with India?
I think it's right to say that over time, Kim Jong-un, the new leader who took over in 2011, he's displayed this enormous focus on being autonomous and deciding things for himself. And that in a larger scale is a reflection of Asia. I think tectonic changes that these summits can produce maybe in future. But what you see already today happening is this enormous autonomy of Asian nations to be able to deal with their issues on their own. And on top of this change, I think, is Kim Jong-un, who is surprising everybody from January 1st speech of his, enormous unilateral initiatives of saying that he's not going to have any tests anymore, he's going to close test sites, and he's now stopped that blaring of propaganda music looking at the south side. So these are taking everybody by surprise. Americans, at least some of them like to believe this is a result of the strong, pressure that Donald Trump's tweets have created on Kim Jong-un. The other explanation is that he's far more calibrated and smart. So in 2011, he had changed the policy of his grandfather and father of Yuche, which is self-reliance, to now saying he wants to give a twin push to both the nuclear program as well as economic program. What is visible is apparently his nuclear deterrent program is complete by now with ICBMs and what he claims to be thermonuclear weapons. He is now planning to use that in terms of drawing political dividends to make major Western nations provide him aid, technology, finances to push his second agenda of economic development. So in that sense, what is the trigger that has made him kind of take a U-turn in this sense, whether it is reliable, the kind of promises he's making? People talk of 2005, 2003, 1995, promises like this were made. Then things did not materialize, of course, at that time. So suspicions are there, but the way he has handled makes him look autonomous of Beijing, but also puts United States and South Korea on defensive. So this well-orchestrated, extremely orchestrated summit meeting of South and North Korean leaders was actually the first step towards the real summit with Donald Trump, because that is going to be the ultimate game changer of recognizing North Korea as a full state. And I think in that sense, this is going to be, and last very 10 seconds point, we saw in two meetings, whereas China and India had advantage of size and stature, you saw the North and South Korean leader taking a walk and sitting on the bench. They had no language issues to deal with. So I think in that sense, communication was much better. And in Chinese and Indian case, you could have later interpretations of what was transpiring and what was followed and understood by two leaders. So both sides had advantages and disadvantages. But I think fundamentally, as you said, it's assertion of Asia and Asian nations beginning to do their things by themselves.
Very aptly summarized, and you call it a U-turn, many also call it a leap, quite literally, that the North Korean leader has taken across that line of demarcation. Very interestingly, the demilitarized zone, the heavily militarized border, will soon, if all goes well, be converted into a peace zone. Let's quickly go across to our correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran, who's been tracking those developments in Seoul very closely for a report that he filed on what really transpired today. He's been tracking those historic talks. Here are the big takeaways.
He came, he saw, he concurred with Moon Jae-in that now there is no turning back, and that it is in the interest of the two Koreas that they have permanent peace on the Korean peninsula. But the big takeaway from the third Inter-Korean summit, which concluded in Panmunjom village inside the demilitarized zone that separates North Korea from South Korea, is that Moon Jae-in told in his joint press statement along with Kim Jong-un that North Korea has agreed that complete denuclearization will be achieved and that it remains their common goal. Now, on balance, Kim Jong-un has shared a new facet of his personality, one that is more amenable to reason, more reasonable, more accommodating, and that this might work to his advantage going forward in changing the world's perception of him as a madman or unpredictable politician. On balance, the challenges going forward remain to resolve the other contentious issues of unification of inter-Korean relations. But Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un have declared in their joint press statements that they will maintain regular contacts going forward, and that Moon Jae-in will be traveling to Pyongyang later this year for a reciprocal visit to North Korea. Also, that they will stop all propaganda broadcasts that are beamed into their respective territories across the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, from the 1st of May, and that this will set the stage. This is a good omen, so to speak, for the much anticipated meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Remember, Donald Trump has always said that he wants North Korea to expressly commit itself to complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization, and that, to my mind, has been indicated in so many words in Moon Jae-in's joint press statement, but he said that complete denuclearization shall be their common objective. All in all, a fruitful, successful inter-Korean summit, one which bodes well for the two Koreas and their respective peoples. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran in Seoul for WION.
All right, it's been a day of resetting ties, of game-changing moves and bold initiatives in two different parts of the Asian continent. As we just highlighted for you, these are developments which hold the potential to cause tectonic shifts in the geopolitics of the respective regions. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Fine Print for now. Thanking both our guests for joining us on the broadcast with those perspectives and details.